If you don't like rock and roll, put this back where you got it. That warning is usually good to heed, but not for the reasons that they state. Rock and roll resurrection is no different. It's not very good, but it is interesting. Mylon LeFevre was all over the 70s rock world. Pete Townsend had him arrange and sing the background vocals for the Tommy soundtrack. He opened for Traffic, The Grateful Dead, Emerson, Lake and Palmer, yes, and scads of others. But if you have not heard of Mylon LeFevre, it could also be for the reasons that you have: God, drugs, and Elvis. Mylon's dad, uncle, and aunt started singing the gospel as the LeFevre Trio in the 1920s. Their big break came on the Grand Ole Opry radio show, where they were paid in 2 live chickens and a 50-pound bag of Purina Chow. Mylon's mother, the daughter of a Tennessee pastor, took her sister-in-law's place in the band when she married into the family in 1934. The LeFevre Trio transformed into simply the LeFevres as children were born. Mylon first sang publicly when he was 5, and he had to stand on a piano bench in order to reach the microphone. The family crisscrossed the Bible Belt throughout the 50s, singing for some of the largest revivals, crusades, and TV evangelists of the decade. In his autobiography, Mylon said that as a young child, he saw really good ministers using God's word for good, alongside other ministers with less honorable intentions. And that bothered him. He also didn't appreciate all the hellfire and brimstone preaching. He was looking for the love of God and not finding it in any of his experiences. He was going through the motions as a member of a family whose entire existence and brand and being revolved around the church, the Southern Church, and not finding it troubled him. Add to that, at 12 years old, Mylon was sent to a state-run boarding school in Tallulah Falls that was, in essence, a reformatory. He was the only one there who still had 2 parents who were married to each other. And he wasn't there because he was a bad kid, but because his parents were busy trying to care for Mylon's younger sister who had severe epilepsy. They were overwhelmed, and their answer was to literally abandon this poor sheltered boy in a scary shithole while they tried to tackle his sister's medical issues. This gutted the 12-year-old, and at 12 you're still a child. And then throughout his teenage years, nearly everyone who was supposed to care for and nurture Mylon didn't. Then in 1962, Army grunt Mylon got a weekend pass to go sing with his family in Memphis. Problem was, he was stationed in South Carolina, and no one was giving this hitchhiking soldier a ride or a break from the freezing cold rain. He didn't get to Ellis Auditorium until 7:30 on Saturday night, minutes before his family was set to take the stage. Unable to sleep, shower, or change, Mylon stepped out in wet army greens and sang the song he wrote the year before called Without Him. In a mirrored booth, Elvis Presley was squirreled away scouting songs for his upcoming gospel record, How Great Thou Art. Elvis was touched by the sight of this young, disheveled army private and had Mylon come to the booth. There, he said he wanted to record without him. And then he also told Colonel Tom not to take the kids' publishing and copyrights, which was customary if Elvis sang your song. That changed everything for Mylon LeFevre. How Great Thou Art was released in 1967. A number of people had recorded without him before Elvis, but no one provided the Elvis-level royalties. Mylon's first check was for $90,000, which is just under $1 million in today's crap economy, and over 120 people have recorded it since. It provided Mylon with the financial freedom and respect that he wanted in the music world. Well, everywhere except LeFevre Incorporated, because even though Mylon's royalties paid for the development of the family business, which now included a recording studio and publishing company, as well as a syndicated TV show, Mylon's dad was at odds with the sideburns and the contemporary nature of the songs he was writing. In 1969, Mylon was fired by his dad for the last time, so he started a band. The band, named Mylon, recorded their first record, We Believe, in 1969 with Alan Toussaint as producer. He also produced Rock and Roll Resurrection and later inducted Mylon into the Gospel Music Hall of Fame. We Believe is full of funky guitar riffs, songs of joy, and black women singing behind groups of long-haired freaky white boys, most of which would go on to form the Atlanta rhythm section. It came out in 1970 on Cratedigging, and many sources called it the first contemporary Christian rock record on a major secular label. But in 1969, Spooky Tooth did put out Ceremony on A&M in the UK with experimental French composer Pierre Henry. It was supposed to parallel the Mass. My husband said it might be considered electronic. Regardless, I listened to it. I don't hear any Mass. Nobody did. Critics hated it, and it killed Spooky Tooth. But Gary Wright's bad mistakes aside, 1970 was seeing a lot of Jesus rock, or people rock, hitting the airwaves. Because in the late 1960s and early 70s, we had hippies and other peaceful people tired of Vietnam and looking for meaning or a higher power that didn't necessarily include weed or acid, or it did. And they were finding Christian street preachers' messages of Jesus and love a comfort. Jesus people were a larger faction, mostly in California, that specifically used folk rock to appeal to those searching, those younger people searching. But young people across the country were very open to a more inclusive church and world during this time, regardless of belief. And little pockets of Christian communes popped up from coast to coast. The Protestant church also began to loosen their restrictions on worldly entertainment, which allowed musicians like Larry Norman and Barry McGuire to lay down the roots for contemporary Christian music. The Catholic Church moved from Latin Mass in 1965, and lo and behold, allowed guitar masses in some of the more modern churches by the early 70s. But wherever you were getting your God rock or people rock, you had a lot to choose from. Andrew Lloyd Webber released Jesus Christ Superstar as a concept album in 1970. It became a Broadway play in 1971, and then it became an Oscar-nominated movie in 1973 with controversy because, change is hard. Also in 1970, Carnegie Mellon student John Michael Tabalik presented Godspell as his drama master's thesis. Jewish composer Stephen Schwartz would write the score for the off-Broadway production in 1971 to the aghast of gatekeeping Christians everywhere. As a side note, the Toronto production of Godspell essentially begat SCTV, and there's going to be a movie about that coming out in September of 2026. In 1969, Orthodox Jew Norman Greenbaum wrote Spirit in the Sky, which sold 2 million copies by 1970. Melanie recorded Lay Down with the Edwin Hawkins Singers, and it went to number 6 that same year, and it's a jam. Signs by the Canadian group Five Man Electrical Band was the B-side to an unsuccessful A-side until it was released on its own in 1971, where it hit number 3 in the States. Three Dog Night released their album Naturally, which carried the hit Joy to the World, and then they followed it in 72 with Black and White off their record Seven Separate Fools. And while not Christian in intent, Georgeharrison released My Sweet Lord in 1970, followed by 6 years of litigation, as well as the biggest selling UK single in 1971. God was everywhere. So it should come as no surprise when Mylon, the band, found themselves opening for Mountain, the band, during their Climbing tour. Climbing is the album that has Mississippi Queen on it. Mylon, the person, became good friends with Bounton's bass player and producer Felix Pappalardi, which led to Mylon the band to sign with Felix Management Company. And then after that, the doors swung wide open. Overnight, Mylon the band was performing with Traffic, 10 Years After, The Who, Jethro Tull, Jay Giles, and then Mylon the person was widening his drug palette. Mylon had been smoking weed as an escape since he was a teenager. You think? So it isn't all the music world's fault, but they gave him more to choose from. It was actually during the recording sessions of Love the One You're With that Mylon was introduced to cocaine. And he found that he was so productive for the first 3 days that he immediately bought a kilo because of this money. Mylon was touring endlessly in the early 70s, and he developed a strong relationship with heroin to help him cope with life on the road. But he did have people friends. One of them was alvinlee from 10 Years After, who invited Mylon to his place in Jamaica after their tour had ended. There, they laid down the groundwork for the record On the Road to Freedom, which was recorded in alvinlee's Castle studio in England. Well, I mean, once he got it finished, but it was okay because Roger Daltrey invited them to use the studio in his castle while they were waiting for it to be done. But this was where Mylon landed, in part to detox again, on the English countryside, surrounded by great musicians inside of their castles. On the Road to Freedom is essentially a supergroup record. Georgeharrison contributed a song and played guitar. Stevie Winwood and Jim Capaldi from Traffic, Boz Burrell from Bad Company, Ian Wallace from King Crimson, and Ron Wood, who had just left Rod Stewart to join the Rolling Stones, were also on it. Oh, and then one day, when both of their drummers were on tour, Georgeharrison suggested that his brother-in-law fill in, who was Mick Fleetwood. It's a good record. It sounds great. It's of the time and these musicians, and there are some good songs here. I especially like the title track. My website has a link to their 1973 appearance on the Midnight Special, and Mylon is as high as a freaking kite. Interestingly, you can hear Georgeharrison, but you can't see him because he was in litigation with his label at the time, which is why on the record he's credited as harigeorgeson. The record was recorded essentially for free, and it did well. But lack of record company backing, because how dare musicians control their own music, meant doom for the record. And everyone was back to being who they were before, which just meant more drugs and more depression for Mylon. Rock and Roll Resurrection was the last rock record by Mylon LeFevre. He had one in 77, one in 78, but this 79 album is the unfortunate example of what happens to your art when you've been an addict for 15 years. Alan Toussaint contributed 3 songs. There were 2 covers, but there was only one song that was all Mylon's. And it's not good. The first song, Let It Flow, sounds like he was up all night and then stumbled into the studio at 5 a.m. unwashed and just nasty. Sam Cooke's Shake and the Isleys' Work to Do were sort of dad rocked into production, and Dance the Night Away was the required 1979 disco entry. Nothing stands out for the right reasons, and sadly, it sounds like it was produced to hide Mylon's flaws. The record's value is in the amazing studio musicians that Toussaint used. Caleb Quay, Tom Robb, Roger Pope, Kenneth Williams, Sam Henry Jr., Leo Nocicelli, Tony Bouchard, Stephen Hughes, they all played with everyone. Everyone. It's easier to list the people they didn't play with than to list all the people that they have. And they are all holding Mylon LeFevre up. Mylon LeFevre went home to Georgia and tried piecing his life back together again. He had a daughter who barely knew him, addictions that knew him too well, and was about to face some serious health issues that literally brought him to Heaven's Gate more than once. He needed to heal his spiritual relationship with God in order to physically heal himself and get over his drug abuse. But in order to do that, he had to walk away from his rock and roll lifestyle. But in order to do that, Mylon had to get out of his record contract. And this is the crazy part. His lawyer argued that Mylon being born again was an act of God, which was required to get out of his Mercury contract. And he won. Mylon gave up his future recording, publishing, and royalty rights, but they were eventually replaced. Mylon and the Broken Heart was the band he put together after he made his peace with God. In 1987, their record, Crack the Sky, won a Grammy for Best Gospel Group. And then they would go on to win 4 Dove Awards, which is the gospel music equivalent to the Grammys. Mylon would eventually move from music to full-time ministry and then continue to spread the word until he died in 2023. Now, this is the part where I usually say you should be able to find this record in the cheaps. But why would you? This is the debris left over from a train wreck. Your time, money, energy, and ears would be better served finding We Believe or definitely On the Road to Freedom. There is nothing to see here. Just move along. I did listen to a greatest hits record of Mylon and the Broken Heart, and it was okay. Musically, it was better than I anticipated, but I don't know much about contemporary Christian music, except that Chicago has a Christian rap station that my compulsive radio changing will find every once in a while when I drive. I have noticed, though, that it's harder to tell if it's God rock. They just aren't singing the Song of St. Francis anymore. Bandsofthelost.com has a ton of supporting material and the links to We Believe, On the Road to Freedom, and Rock and Roll Resurrection. If you'd like to hear about other records you may or may not have heard of back in the day, feel free to subscribe to Bands of the Lost YouTube channel or check us out at bandsofthelost.com. Happy digging. Bandsofthelost.com has a ton of supporting miracles.